Mass U.S. embassy shutdowns, an unprecedented move the government blames on an active terror threat. A global travel alert is issued to all Americans as thousands of prisoners break out of jail across several countries. Is al-Qaeda at work? This is Inside Story. Welcome to Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna. The international police agency Interpol has put the world on a security alert. It's all because of a series of prison breaks across several countries, including Iraq, Libya and Pakistan. And just a day after that warning, the US announced it was temporarily shutting down its embassies across the Middle East and North Africa. Let's get the details now from Al Jazeera's Dominic Kane.
This was the central prison in Deraa Ismail Khan in Pakistan last week after a major assault. Attackers disguised as police approached the complex and then blasted it with rocket launchers and machine guns. In all, 248 prisoners escaped, including around 45 the Pakistani government considered particularly dangerous. So far, at least 40 have been recaptured, but the vast majority are still at large. Earlier, more than 1,100 prisoners escaped from the al-Qaeda jail in Libya. Again, many of those escaping were considered highly dangerous. And again, only a small proportion have been recaptured. And days before that, al-Qaeda had said it had helped as many as 500 inmates to break out of Iraq's Abu Ghraib prison in another apparently well-planned attack. In all three cases, many of those escaping were hardened fighters linked to armed groups like al-Qaeda. It's led the international police agency, Interpol, to issue a global alert and to question publicly whether the attacks were linked.
We're talking about thousands of these dedicated jihadists being free to go about their business. We should really be concerned about that, and they will go about their business. Make no mistake. These people are dedicated, they are politically and theoretically motivated, and they will strike, and they will strike against the number one enemy, which is the United States.
The US weapon of choice to deal with these kinds of groups has been drone strikes. Despite President Obama's declaration this year that the drone would no longer play such a prominent role, it is still in use. Last week, 9 people were killed in Yemen in 2 separate drone attacks. Some people there say that such attacks merely provide more ammunition to al-Qaeda and other armed groups. The threat of attacks on Western interests there has prompted several governments to close their embassies across the region on Sunday. But with so many escaped prisoners still at large, the wider threat they pose may last much longer. Dominic Kane, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's just take a look how widespread these US embassy closures are. 22 of its diplomatic missions will be closed from Mauritania east across North Africa. Embassies and consulates will also be closed in the Gulf, Afghanistan and Bangladesh. Well, to discuss all of this, I'm joined by our 3 guests. In London, Will Geddes, Managing Director and founder of International Corporate Protection, a security company. He's a security and counterterrorism specialist. From Islamabad, Imtiaz Gul, head of the Center for Research and Security Studies. He's also author of several books on al-Qaeda and tribal ties in Pakistan. And joining us via Skype from Sana'a, Hakim Al-Masmari, editor-in-chief of the Yemen Post. But first, let's go to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where joining us via Skype is Christopher Hill, former US ambassador to Iraq. Welcome to you. What do you believe, Mr. Ambassador, is the primary cause for the embassy shutdown?
I suspect the embassy shutdown is based on some information about a plot against U.S. interests abroad. I do not believe it's necessarily related to these prison breaks, serious as they are, of the last few weeks. these plots usually take a lot more time to plan, and I rather doubt these prison breaks are part and parcel of that. Secondly, I'd like to point out that these prison breaks could well be more in the context of these broader issues within the Arab world as opposed to the issue of the United States. So I think the State Department has reacted, to use its own term, with an abundance of caution to this information that there are plots against the U.S. But the fact that they have reacted in such a broad way with some 21 embassies suggests that they do not know at this point where the potential attacks are focused, and for that reason have to be very broad and very general in their handling of it.
How specific would be the information that they are acting on?
Well, it seems to be more than just two people having a chat somewhere that they overheard. It seems to be specific to a plot. You know, they don't do this lightly. First of all, there's some downsides to it. We need our embassies operating. Secondly, some of the host governments are quite upset at this potential because of these 21 embassies or so. Probably 20 of them have nothing to do with the problem, and I think the host governments get very upset. And thirdly, I think it kind of sends a signal that we're somehow hunkering down, which is not the kind of signal we want to send to any terrorist group. So I think it was done with an abundance of caution and a real concern that there is a real threat in the making.
Well, thanks to Ambassador Christopher Hill. Now back to our three guests, Will Geddes, Imtiaz Gul, and Hakim al-Masmari. Let's begin with Will Geddes in London. Do you believe these prison escapes were coordinated, or is it just a coincidence that they all happened at roughly the same time period?
Well, I think it's very difficult to say right now, and following on from what Ambassador Hill was saying, I think one wouldn't necessarily correlate that directly with the embassies seeking to actually close over this period of time. However, it does have a very significant impact into the longer position in terms of what the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula may be considering, and certainly bringing a lot of capability back into its fold.
Well, let's go to Imtiaz Gul at this particular point. Your view, do you think that there's a coordination here, first of all?
Well, I don't think there would be any direct coordination between what has happened in Iraq or Kandahar or Niger, I think in June, or in Pakistan. But I think what is common to all of them is the ideology. Particularly in Pakistan, we are seeing the emergence of a local al-Qaeda and a new linchpin, that is Adnan Rashid, a former Pakistani armed forces member who broke out of the jail last year and now masterminded the jailbreak in Deir Ismail Khan last week. So I think, and also probably you could link them in a way that Emmanuel Zawahiri, the al-Qaeda chief, issued a statement on July the 31st saying that they would do everything possible to secure the release of their prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. And almost the same day, Adnan Rashid, the Pakistani al-Qaeda linchpin, vowed to conduct more raids on jails where Taliban or other al-Qaeda inspired, al-Qaeda linked prisoners are being held. So in that way, this is sort of a connected phenomena, however, may not be necessarily coordinated among various arms of al-Qaeda in different parts of the world.
Well, Hakim al-Masmari in Sana'a, there we heard specific reference to the call by Ayman al-Zawahiri for attacks on U.S. interests. That call actually was posted on the internet at the end of last month on July the 30th.
Al-Zawahiri and before him, bin Laden have always been calling for the attacks and strikes against U.S. interests. So it's not only that created this sudden fear and worry. I would say that also the death of Saeed al-Shihri, who was the #2 al-Qaeda in command in the Arabian Peninsula, when he was killed last month by a U.S. drone strike. Also, Ramadan is a month of worship in the Arab world, whereas U.S. drone strikes continue to take place in Ramadan during and killing sometimes militants and at times civilians. Last week, 1 child was killed and 3 civilians in drone strikes. So there are many reasons for these, the anger and the worry in the Middle East, and the U.S. felt that the anger reached a limit or a stage where its interests were at risk.
Well, Imtiaz Gul, there we heard reference to Abu Sufyan al-Azdi, who was killed in the middle of last month in a drone strike, and there were a series of calls in the wake of his killing from a number of groups aligned to al-Qaeda. So here we have yet another incident which adds to what appears to be a bonfire of anger manifesting itself in some kind of action being planned, it would appear.
Well, no doubt that such actions fuel and breed resentment and trigger a lot of angry reactions wherever al-Qaeda sympathizers or supporters find themselves. But I would say that I would call it a little overreaction to some threats that the United States intelligence agencies may have intercepted, because on the one hand, General Martin Dempsey, the chairman, Joint Chief of Staff, talks of specific threats, but in response to specific threats, you do not really shut down more than almost 36 embassies across the world. And such an action, I personally think, gives an unnecessary publicity to al-Qaeda and its affiliated organizations wherever they are, and probably this provides them with one excuse just to ratchet up violence and actions against the United States. Because one has to keep in mind, when the alert is high, then these organizations may not necessarily hit the targets that they want to. They would expect and allow the authorities to become complacent for a while, to scale down the alert and then strike. So I think this has been sort of an overreaction to unspecified threats that may have been intercepted from here or there.
Well, Will Geddes, I'd like you to react to the thoughts that it might be an overaction, and also the fact that we did have claims of a very specific threat according to the US State Department, and yet the reaction to this very specific threat was pretty wide.
Yeah, I mean, I think inevitably the State Department are, as Ambassador Hill was saying, taking a very cautionary position, certainly with regards to its assets overseas. However, it's a very, very delicate decision to make. And I think, as your other guest said, closing down embassies and diplomatic missions sends almost a bit of a message to al-Qaeda to say, you know, you're winning on one kind of level. However, having said that, there has been supposedly some very specific intelligence, particularly within the region. It may not have been specific, and it's highly unlikely that the State Department and the CIA are going to go loud in terms of what that intelligence was and where it was actually coming from, because certainly it would compromise some of the intelligence gathering assets. However, what it is believed is that it was communications interceptions rather than human asset intelligence, and it was sufficiently enough for the State Department to take this very, very cautious position. And although one could say, yes, al-Qaeda has won on one level in terms of all these missions closing, it's far better to be safe than sorry. And certainly in bearing in mind in the particular region, particularly in Yemen, where there is a very strong presence, unless you take things very, very carefully, you can fall apart and certainly present an opportunity or a vulnerability to al-Qaeda to exploit.
Well, Hakim al-Masbari, would you like to pick up on that particular point, that widespread warnings like this actually throw fuel onto the fire?
I agree with your first guest, and I did talk to a couple of national security officials here in Yemen, and they told me that the information, the reaction was misleading. It raised the fear among the people, and the Yemeni government will not take these warnings or signals very seriously, but they will be cautious and create checkpoints and deploy security forces just to be on the safe side. But they did tell me that they feel that this information was misleading and that not clear evidence was presented to the Yemeni government to prove that there could be a threat, in specific in Yemen, of an al-Qaeda attack taking place.
Well, Imtiaz Gul, you made mention a little bit earlier to the fact that Ramadan is ending within the next few days, that this is a particular time of the year, some analysts have pointed out, where there is a rise in activity. But it does appear from what State Department has been saying and what general U.S. intelligence experts have been saying, that this was caused by what is called chatter on the internet, that various eavesdroppers were heard hearing discussion going on. Do you think the time that we are looking at coming towards the end of Ramadan could also be consequentially lead to an increase in engagement or talk about engagement with US interests, for example?
Well, I have a little problem with this overhearing of chatting over the social media or over the internet, that even if you have overheard something, then you don't publicize it. You would rather move into action, operate, and act against the people, the possible perpetrators, rather than publicizing it all over and creating a kind of scare. And that scare basically goes to the advantage of the al-Qaeda itself. I was talking about the Ramzan drawing to a close only in the sense that towards the end of the month, there is a lot of festivity, the pre-Eid al-Adha, shopping all over. So while al-Qaeda might like to strike within the Muslim communities, where particularly in the evenings when people are out to shop for the Eid festival, but I don't see any really plausible reason for al-Qaeda to pick up this particular last week of Ramadan for attacks on the American interests. So I really don't understand why this overreaction, why we have seen this overreaction by the US intelligence.
Well, we'll get us. The point was made by Imtiaz Gal a short while ago, and that is that what could happen is that people, if there was some action planned, may well now lie low because of these warnings. It's a fine balance from a security point of view, is it not, to create a protection by creating publicity, which in itself may become self-defeating in terms of timescales?
Yeah, absolutely. And one's got to consider that the war on terrorism is fundamentally like a chess game, and you've got to move your pieces around the board in such a way that you hopefully manipulate or engineer the enemy into the position that you want them to. Now, when we look at something like this widespread closure of diplomatic missions, this is unprecedented. This is very unusual. And I go back to my point before, that the State Department would not have made this call unless they felt there was good reason to do so. Having said that, yes, by taking these actions, you may push certainly any terrorist cells back into more of a hibernation position for them to regroup. But what it may also have achieved very successfully is in intercepting any of those missions that may have been planned, they believed, clandestinely, which will now have been thwarted by those targets not being quite as reachable as they may have thought.
Well, Hakim Al-Masmari, let's just look at the particulars of something where Yemen has fallen particularly under the spotlight because of those ongoing drone attacks by the US, drone attacks which last week alone claimed 9 lives, as we said earlier, very high value to al-Qaeda operative earlier on in the month. Does Yemen feel particularly vulnerable in the wake of a general US closure of missions and of other countries?
Not really. Again, al-Qaeda is weaker today than it was 2 years ago. What surprises me most is that 2 years ago, when al-Qaeda controlled provinces and cities and towns in Yemen, we did not hear any closure of embassies or such warnings. Whereas today, where al-Qaeda is handicapped, no territory, or very, very few territory under its control, and these warnings come today. Why didn't these warnings come two years ago when al-Qaeda was really in control of territory in Yemen? Today, al-Qaeda is handicapped. Many of its leaderships and middle class members have been killed by drone strikes. Hundreds of drone strikes have taken place over the last year, and the Yemeni government is on the ground campaign, continues to hunt down al-Qaeda members. So they are weaker than they were a year ago. Yes, they are weaker than they were 2 years ago. Are they a threat today? Yes, they are, but not as big as of a threat that the U.S. is picturing it.
Well, Imtiaz Gal, that is a particularly valid point, not only in relation to Yemen, but also perhaps to Pakistan. Groups sympathetic to al-Qaeda may perhaps be more stronger a couple of years ago than they are now. Yet there was not such a wide reaction by the US at that particular time. And yet there is, when some would argue that these groups are far weaker than they were.
Well, it's difficult to say. While the relentless drone strikes from the CIA have driven out, either taken out or driven out a lot of African, Arab, al-Qaeda operatives, top leadership. They have simply fanned out into different regions, particularly out of Pakistan. But we have seen the emergence of a new generation of al-Qaeda, which has roots within the Pakistani society, in various sections of the society, whether it is the armed forces or the population at large. And that is, I think, a much more lethal threat to Pakistan. And in that sense, al-Qaeda, probably the Pakistani al-Qaeda, I would say the auxiliary of al-Qaeda Central, it would be much more stronger than what it used to be, because it's very much rooted within the society. It has the social space available to it through sympathy and support. Also, it has an insider information network within the armed forces, within the bureaucracy, from within the police. That's why we are seeing these jailbreaks or very relentless attacks on security installations in the interest of Pakistan. So I think in that sense, al-Qaeda in Pakistan or organizations inspired by al-Qaeda are today much more stronger than they would have been like 2 years ago.
Well, Will Geddes, your view on that. They have seen the head cut off, the US would believe, with its ongoing incessant zone strikes. But has that led to the limbs of the body multiplying and becoming more difficult to deal with?
Absolutely. I've been saying this for many years, that al-Qaeda is like a hydra, and you can cut a number of the heads off, but new heads will spring. You're also talking about a very different beast to what it used to be, and they've got a lot smarter, as has the counterterrorism effort against them. You know, they've become much cleverer in terms of how they operate, in terms of how they communicate, how they raise their finance. And certainly we've been seeing, certainly an emergence over the last few years of their coordination with other groups, other, if you like, al-Qaeda emirates elsewhere and groups around the world, where they have been maintaining not only communication but also support and providing resource for other operational cells. So although, yes, perhaps some of the big spectaculars that they may have wished to have carried out as they have in the past have been somewhat sort of, if you like, curbed or controlled a great deal more. It doesn't mean that it's beyond their reach, but they're a lot more strategic in terms of their attacks and certainly in their planning. So again, it's dealing with quite a different entity to what it was a few years ago, and I think it's dangerous to say it's not as powerful as it was.
Well, Hakim al-Masmari, that leads us to the point of whether actions such as drone strikes, actions such as publicizing possible attacks without being specific about the attacks, is leading to increased anger, perhaps. And in a country like Yemen, those drone strikes have created as much of a problem, perhaps, as they have solved, have they not?
They have so, and just to comment on your other guest's answer, that we don't hear of any major attack happening internationally by al-Qaeda today, whereas we did hear that 2 years ago and before that. Al-Qaeda is handicapped, and it shows on the ground that they are not capable anymore of attacking or conducting major attacks. So that's for that. On the drone strikes, it has hurt the publicity and the reputation of the United States very, very much, especially since Yemenis used to respect the United States and seeing the U.S. as the savior of democracy and freedom, whereas it's illegally killing people on Yemeni territory without giving them a fair trial. I asked numerous national security officials on names of those who were killed, and they honestly did not know many of the names of the suspects who were killed in U.S. drone strikes. So killing someone just for the sake of having doubt in his actions is on all standards, or in all standards, illegal, and does not help any war or any mission, whether you're trying to eradicate al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups. And this only gives them more sympathy locally, because sometimes, and eventually happens a lot in Yemen, civilians die. And this is what helps al-Qaeda recruit and build sympathizers. And then these sympathizers are then suddenly accused of being al-Qaeda supporters, while they are honestly not supporters, but have no choice after seeing on the ground where innocent people have been killed, and they have no choice only to hate or be angry at the U.S. drone strikes and how they're conducted on Yemeni soil.
Well, a cycle of attack and retaliation, but at that point, thank you to my guests, Will Geddes, Imtiaz Gul, Hakim al-Masmari. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.